Good afternoon. Thank you for coming on this rainy day of Washington where everything is in chaos, and appreciate that you got here. And I'd especially like to, in the very beginning, thank NEI. Marv Fertel is here. Where's Marv? And Tony, and of course Maria. One of the things they've done to assist Japan in the recovery is this new report, The Way Forward. And I think it was Marv Fertel who originally offered the advice to Tokyo Electric right after the crisis that look at the compensation plan, because one of the challenges you're going to have are the liability and so forth arising from Fukushima. And I think back 5 years ago, almost to the day, March 11th, 3/11 as the Japanese know it, when the terrible crisis hit, the tsunami and the earthquake, and the tens of thousands that were killed in Sendai that particular day. It was a great tragedy for Japan, and at the same time, we all turned our TV sets on and we saw the American military helping out by putting troops into Sendai Airport. And we also first learned of Fukushima and the great crisis that was occurring there. At the time, my son was actually in Japan. He got a doctorate in biology from Kyoto University in chimpanzees. He's doing better than his father. And he called me, he says, "Dad, I can't get any radiation pills from the U.S. Embassy." And he was about 200 or 300 miles away from the site of Fukushima. But he was worried, as were every parent in Japan, about their children, their families, including me. I immediately put in a call to the U.S. Embassy and was ignored because they were so busy helping out Japan. And of course, seeing Julia Bisconti here, I called Julia. In fact, at the same time, Julia was dispatched with Pete Lyons, having served in Tokyo as our energy attaché. They were pulling her off the bench and sending her back to Fukushima. And I was giving a press conference with the ambassador of Japan, Mr. Fujisaki, at the time at the Council on Foreign Relations. This, again, was 2 weeks after Fukushima had begun. And I called Julia. I sent her my speech, right, Julia? Give me some comments. I need help. And Julia said, "You just don't know what's happening here. It's absolutely impossible for me to give you guidance." Right, Julia? You can't believe how bad it is here. And it bad in a sense that it was confusing, but the United States Embassy at that particular time in Tokyo, I think everybody there should be awarded a medal, because you were handling the energy, you were handling the military, you were handling cooperation with the Japanese government. Nobody really knew what was happening. Anyway, Ambassador Fujisaki and I struggled through our press conference to do the best we could. At the time, I was chairman of the DOE Nuclear Advisory Committee. I immediately saw that the Department of Energy was on the ball, providing help. So it was the DOE, it was the White House, it was the military, all coming to the assistance of Japan in probably what was the greatest crisis since World War II for Japan. And the effort has continued. And so today, 5 years later, we're not talking about crisis, we're talking about progress. Now, is the glass half full, half empty? Is it a third full, 2/3 empty? I don't know. But the fact is that progress has been steadily made in Japan, not only in securing the Fukushima site, and I'm very pleased that Mr. Anagawa is here. He flew all the way from Tokyo. Not only does he have to handle the nuclear division of TEPCO, he's also the #1 guy out in the field. And I want to say, Anagawa, if anybody has a hard job, you do. And if anybody really thinks there's a harder job in the world today than what Mr. Anagawa has, then I'd like them to stand up and be recognized. And the fact that you came here is very much appreciated. Marv asked a very poignant question to me, because I always like to ask people, what are the toughest questions I can ask on the stage today? And Marv, you said, well, just ask Dale what progress has been made in the last 3 years. So that's your question, Dale. Of course, when we have a distinguished journalist and we have a distinguished expert in radiation who will clarify things. But I'd first like today to introduce Maria, who's here as the Chief Operating Officer of NEI. And Maria has the distinction of having been a Chief Nuclear Operator, the first female in the nuclear fleet, I think very nearby here, if I recall. She's came to NEI about a year ago, very distinguished background, and she's going to welcome everybody and give some remarks. The format will be the following today. First, I will tell you there will be a cocktail hour. It starts at 6, so you have to stay through the whole session. 5. Oh, we're going now at 5. That's good. I just saved us an hour. It'll be right here. So the reward will be if you can stay through, you get to drink. The sessions will be, each of the speakers I will introduce in turn. They will give presentations of 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for each one. I ask you to ask the most difficult questions you can, because the importance here is that you have a sense of openness and transparency. TEPCO has volunteered that. We have the chairman of the Reform Committee here, Dale Klein, former chair of the NRC as well. He's been the most on-site manager of this. After everybody's given their presentations and we've had a couple questions for each panel, then we will have an open discussion. And just rise and announce who you're from, where you're from, and then I will direct the questions. Maria, welcome. Thank you for being here. And Maria and Marv and Tony, thank you for hosting us today.
Great, thank you. Okay, I have some slides and I'm looking for the clicker. Does anybody have that?
I have.
Thank you. Not that I was suspecting you, but I was looking at you.
I wanted to make it difficult.
So thank you very much. I'm honored to be here today, and I appreciate the opportunity as we step through the prepared remarks and any questions that you might have. In the months and years following the accident, the U.S. nuclear energy industry has invested billions of dollars to verify that our reactors can withstand natural events even more severe than those that were assumed in their original designs. We have upgraded and added additional safety equipment, updated our procedures, and trained our plant workers on these changes. These safety enhancements have been very purposely done based on well-defined lessons learned from Fukushima. The U.S. industry conducted detailed analyses of the events at Fukushima Daiichi to inform the steps that we should take here in the United States with our reactors. We've worked as a unified industry in a structured and deliberate manner to ensure we prioritized and are taking the steps which are most significant to improving safety. And we've maintained open and transparent communications with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other stakeholders throughout this 5-year journey. And if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide shows among our key stakeholders are our Japanese counterparts. And this slide is an example of a sharing that we have done along the way in this journey. Before joining the Nuclear Energy Institute, while I was a chief nuclear officer for the Constellation Energy plants, I joined my American chief nuclear officers in reciprocal visits with the chief nuclear officers from Japan. In 2013, we toured the Fukushima Daiichi and Daini sites and the surrounding area. And in 2014, we hosted the Japanese CNOs at the Palo Verde facility in Arizona. And that's the photo that you see behind me. These have been very important interactions, as was the collaboration among the American chief nuclear officers that led the U.S. nuclear energy industry to develop what is known as the FLEX strategy. And that's really the foundation of our response. It addresses the major problems encountered in Japan: the loss of power and water to maintain effective cooling. The FLEX strategy stations additional backup equipment at each nuclear power plant and at the National Response Centers in Memphis and Phoenix, and these are known as SAFER centers. It's called FLEX because much of the additional backup safety equipment is portable and it has multiple uses, while other equipment is tailored to very specific safety applications. This flexible approach builds on existing multi-layered safety systems to protect against unforeseen events and is being replicated by the industry and other nations. Essentially, all U.S. nuclear power plants will have Flex implemented by the end of this year. The equipment ranges from diesel-driven pumps and electric generators to ventilation, hoses. No, there we go. There's an example. Hoses and fittings, satellite communications gear. The new equipment is stored in protected locations at each site to ensure that it can be used if other systems that comprise a facility's multi-layered safety strategy are in fact compromised. And from the industry collaboration, we designed common connections so that the equipment can also be shared between sites. I think we have another example. Okay. The NRC is requiring new instruments to alert operators of changes in the water level in used fuel storage pools. Nuclear power plants are installing this additional instrumentation to provide operators with vital information about cooling water level and temperature. All U.S. nuclear power plants are scheduled to have this installed by the end of the year. The industry has had severe accident management guidelines in place since the late 90s. These guidelines are being updated to capture the lessons learned from Fukushima and to better integrate them with emergency operating procedures and Flex strategy. Maintaining our severe accident management guidelines is an industry safety initiative at all U.S. nuclear plants, and the industry has committed to the NRC to make timely updates of these site-specific guidelines. Consistent with our standards, the industry is providing training on these updated guidelines to operators and plant emergency personnel. Detailed analyses of revised earthquake hazard estimates have also been conducted for every nuclear plant site. And 20 facilities are completing a more detailed risk assessment based on the results of these estimates. These complex assessments will be complete by December of 2019. Now, in the interim, expedited seismic evaluations have been conducted to verify that key safety functions would be maintained even in the event of an earthquake up to twice as severe as what the plant was designed for initially. Last year, companies completed the reevaluation of site flooding hazards at 56 plant sites. These evaluations will be complete by May at the remaining sites. Those sites that are not completed yet, we're actually awaiting information from the NRC and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Industry and NRC research has shown that the best way to reduce the risk of radiation release in the event of a severe accident is through active reactor fuel cooling and controlled venting from the containment building. Also, vents can be used to remove excess heat and pressure from containment before there's damage to the reactor core. Enhancing our venting strategies for the primary containment is underway. Some sites, in fact, are complete, and others have their changes in place by 2019. I had tremendous confidence in the safety of U.S. nuclear energy facilities before the tragic earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011, that triggered the Fukushima accident. My confidence and pride in the safety commitment of the U.S. fleet is even stronger today. This has been a challenging 5 years. Nuclear energy remains a vital part of our nation's clean energy future. So this was a challenge worth taking. We learned the lessons well, and I'm confident in how well prepared we are today. Safety has always been and will continue to be our industry's foremost priority. Thank you. And I'm willing to take questions now. Sure.
Let's get some tough questions now that we've heard the industry's view. Yes, and could you introduce yourself too, please?
Certainly, thank you. I'm Stephen Donnelly with, here's a mic, Steve.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Dolly with Platts. Thanks for your presentation. Maria, billions of dollars invested. Can you sharpen the pencil on that a little bit? How much has the industry spent and will be spending in response to the lessons from Fukushima? And if that's too nebulous, maybe in response to NRC requirements post-Fukushima. The last estimates I saw from you all were on the order of $3.5 to $4 billion, but that was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and so I agree. The question being, how much have we really spent? It's $4 billion is what we're estimating across the industry on post-Fukushima learnings.
And in the future?
That should include the future modifications that need to be made. The entire investment would be about $4 billion for the industry.
So you don't expect major escalations to that estimate based on evaluations of the cost of hardened containment vents, things like that?
No. Question is, do we expect that to escalate appreciably? Those estimates for the containment hardened vents that are not already installed are built into that number. So yeah, that's what we expect.
Do you have a, well, I guess I can do the division per unit. Thank you.
Yeah, and be careful doing that per unit because some units, boiling water reactors, for example, required some additional investment than others, so it's not exactly fair to divide equally.
Can I ask a question of Chairman Klein? Is that adequate from the point of view of the NRC?
Well, as a recovery regulator, we always like things even more safe. But I think the NRC has done their Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. And I believe that the safety enhancements that have been implemented have been sufficient to protect the public and the environment.
Okay, good. Another question for Maria then, please. Sorry, Dale, I told you it'd be spontaneous today. Who's got another good question for NEI? I have an idea. Marv Fertel, do you have a question for Maria?
Not for Maria.
Okay, not for Maria. Okay, another question. I saw a hand going once, going twice. Yes, please. Yeah, and you can stand up too.
Sure. Naomi Gingold, Public Radio International. My question is, just take a seat. You keep referencing lessons learned. What specifically are those?
So again, fundamentally, when we say the lessons learned at Fukushima, for the challenges that they have, the want of water and power at a critical point to ensure that they could keep the core covered. And so really the foundation of our learning is, regardless of what happens, if major portions of your site are affected and the multiple layers of safety that we have built in, you need to be able to have water and you need to be able to move that water. So you need power, you need pumps, and you need the ability to tap in. Now, when that water doesn't mean it's in a tank. It could be in a nearby lake. It could be, that kind of thing. You have to be able to get it, access it, and get it to the right place. And that's fundamentally the learning. Although we have many built-in and designed defense in depth, we need to be able, in the case of Fukushima, survive a tsunami, survive a very site-devastating event, and still be able to have power and water and keep the core covered.
Question? Any other questions here? Yes, please.
Hi, Jeff Beatty with the Energy Daily. Maria, NEI, as you know better than I, has been engaged in this back and forth with NRC to sort of decide what requirements or proposals are justified based on the lessons learned. And you've pushed back on some things being overlapping and perhaps overly burdensome. Is it NEI's view that NRC almost has that right now? Has that correct, or is there a lot more back and forth that's going to take place in the coming year or so?
Yeah, so from a Fukushima perspective, which I think is your question specifically, I actually think this is a model of very good behavior on both the industry's part and the NRC's part. And that, by that I mean there was give and take, right? So there was requirements, there was conversations, there was the ability for the industry to take that in, to propose some solutions, a lot of back and forth, as you say. I would call that healthy back and forth, and then landing on behalf of the industry in a solution set that we could buy into, that we could drive, that we could invest in, and in such really push across the industry and hold ourselves accountable to making that happen. And when we formed what we called the Fukushima Response Steering Committee, which was a combination of chief nuclear officers, the Electric Power Research Institute, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, as well as NEI, that was an excellent coalition to start this journey as an aligned industry, and it served us very, very well.
Maria, can you say something in industry cooperation at the CNO level? You were a CNO. We have IMPO after 3 Mile Island. Japanese have Yansi. Can you talk about the CNO to CNO relationship that's emerged between the U.S. and Japan?
Sure. Let me first start with the CNO to CNO relationship in the United States. And I think based on that relationship, it set us up to have very strong collaboration with the Japanese CNO. So to start with, within the United States, I would say as a chief nuclear officer, at any given time on any given day, I felt very comfortable that I could call any one of the chief nuclear officers. I could have a conversation, a question if there's something that I needed, understanding best practices at their plant, exchanging of resources, et cetera. We are very open and available to each other in that way. I would look to our response of Fukushima as an example of that. So when I mentioned the flex strategy and I mentioned that we have this flexible portable equipment that we keep at our sites, one of the first things that we did as a team is said, well, you know what? One of the best things could happen is if we would have the ability to share this equipment. The only way we're going to have to share this equipment is if we step back and we understand the connections that each one of us are using. So very early on in the process, we standardized the connections, whether it's the connections of the electrical equipment or whether it's the connections of the hydraulic equipment, so that if I had a site and I had equipment and a nearby site had some sort of an issue or challenge, my equipment can be used at that site and it can be readily hooked up. All the procedures work the same. There's no changes necessary. And that was an example of the collaboration within the U.S. nuclear fleet that was sort of a natural evolution of how we do business together. Very powerful, because now today, of the 62 sites that we have in the United States, the flex equipment, if you can imagine, there's a backup now. All 62 of those sites can back each other up. In addition, we have the National Safer Response Centers. So there's real defense in depth with what we've put in place. So given that, we again, as we mentioned, reached out to the Japanese CNOs as part of our journey, and found a very open dialogue and collaborative dialogue. We went over to Japan, as I said. We've hosted the Japanese back here. As changes happen, right, new CNOs are born here in the United States. And so when new folks became CNOs since our visit, we sent the new CNOs over to the Japanese to, again, further that relationship and that collaboration. We also then very specifically understood a visit is nice. We appreciated that, got to know people face to face. But we also then set up specific relationships with the CNOs in Japan and specific CNOs in the United States so that they could have a more follow-up relationship, a twinning, if you will, that they could have further dialogue and discussion. And I think that's been very successful. I, and in fact, a handful of CNOs are headed back to Japan here in a few weeks for another forum over there. So very much look forward to that.
Oh, thank you, Maria. We'll come back to you during the question and answer. But one thought I had is to ask Julia Bisconti, put her on the spot here, who was in Japan during Fukushima and knows Maria very well as well. What was it like in the embassy in those first few weeks? What did the U.S. government do? I think you're still with the Department of Energy. By the way, I am the godfather of Julia's child, so I do keep very close track of Arabella as well. But Julia, the DOE, in addition to NEI, has done extraordinary things in Japan, never trumpeted itself at all, continues day to day helping with Fukushima. Our national labs are there on the spot, given our experience in radiation and so forth. But would you like to take just a couple minutes and take the microphone and just say what were your first impressions and what are your impressions now? Because again, we want to get to before and after. As Marv Fertel said, what was it like? Where are we now? Where are we going? Would you mind just saying a couple unprepared remarks?
Damien's going to come up with me because we're partners in front of us.
Okay.
Well,
I actually had a question, and so I think Bill saw my hand go up, and I was actually going to ask about something unrelated to. This is Damien Pico. Damien was also an attaché
you,
in
Damien?
Tokyo, and he was also one of the first folks to go to the embassy. He actually went the first week, and then we switched spots, and I went over. But I was actually going to first ask you a question, because the Department of Energy has a tremendous amount of collaboration with Japan. In the moments after the accident, we had a tremendous amount of information exchange. We put into force a team that was working with our partners at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the interagency, and we put our national laboratory specialists to work to try to answer a lot of the technical questions. We also had a lot of questions about where the United States could be most helpful in doing its research. I mean, that was one of the biggest questions. So what problems does Japan need to solve? And it was, it was a very difficult time, because the Japanese were trying to focus on the accident, and it took time away from something else that they were doing to focus on how they could use international resources. So I think as a first step, they kind of reached to people closer to them. But as the progress, as the period developed after the accident, we had these daily meetings, which really brought in the United States and brought in all the government, and really helped people share information in a very fast way. I think there were the 12 o'clock meetings. And I saw relationships really develop between us and the Japanese, and there was a lot of trust, and it was really impressive. But I'll just let Damien say something, but I've been in Paris, so I've been seeing some of the cooperation that's been going through the OECD NEA, Fukushima work that's been going on there. I've just returned here, so I'm getting my arms around all of the tremendous work that's going on with our working groups through the Department of Energy on cleanup. The one question before I turn to Damien that I'll ask is, this question about, we're always learning, right, from things, and we're trying to do things better. So, the question that I had, that I was going to ask Maria, was the question about lessons for the international community, because, there's always this question about highest standards. Of course, it's an evolving process, but what are the lessons that we would give our perspectives from the United States to the international community on the issue of safety, regulation, and there's the question not only of evolving regulation, but also the question of effective implementation of regulation, because having worked in the Senate on a stint, I saw, just tremendously, it is a question of effective implementation of regulation. So how far must we continue to evolve? How safe is safe enough? And the difficult questions that Japan faces. I don't know if Damien.
Well, Damien, why don't you add a couple points, and we'll let Maria close out the discussion, all righty?
Okay, Brett.
Damien, thank you for all your work, too, because you took over from Julia how many years ago in Japan?
Actually, you asked for a before and after. I'm going to give you before, during, and after.
Okay, can you do it in 2 minutes? This was the uncharted.
Shut that man's mic off. Yeah, so I was stationed in Japan in the DOE office, and I left just a few months before the accident. But once the accident occurred, I was on a plane and I flew back out there. When I left, Tokyo was a thriving, exciting metropolis with 3% about of the world's GDP. When I came back, it was almost spooky because a lot of people left the city and a lot of people were kind of hunkering down. So, where normally you'd see crowds of people, you'd see lines of taxis, you saw nothing, and there were shortages of things like water because people were hoarding bottled water and so forth. Having gone back several times since then, it's once again a thriving, exciting metropolis with about 3% of the world's GDP. So I think the city in its psychology has largely recovered. In terms of the DOE, our response was pretty aggressive. Our National Security Agency sent out a mobile monitoring team. So within days, we had our folks flying over the sites with instruments, and they were able to get a pretty good idea of the progress and the propagation of the plume. And this was very much appreciated by the Japanese because there was a loss of credibility with some of the Japanese government agencies. So the addition of the U.S. input on things like the condition of the plume and so forth, and a description of the events, I think was reassuring to people because, okay, here's another voice and they don't have a reason to be biased. At least that was the view. The NRC also deployed a team. They had a lot of very smart people there who were giving advice. And the DOE sent a few feds. We had a few feds there. But we also sent some of our severe accident analysis people who already had relationships with the Japanese and were able to do some quick and dirty analyses and give people a pretty good idea. So I would say our response was impressive, it was effective, and I wouldn't say so much that the Japanese were like, oh yeah, that's great, we needed that answer. It's like, oh, we got the same answer too, or something similar. So it was more of a reinforcing or like a confirming function. For the most part, that's a gross generalization, of course, but I thought we melded pretty well, and I thought it was very effective, and I thought it was very helpful, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we've had a long-standing and deep relationship with Japan.
All righty, thank you, Damien. I think we should give them an applause and let them get seated. And totally spontaneous, unplanned. But Maria, why don't you respond to this question? And let me say, the DOE work continues today. It never ends in this particular case, but it's been a great partnership. Maria, one last word in response to Julia's question, then we're going to go on to Miles.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll just kind of restate the question to say, from an NRC regulatory perspective, what would be our advice to the rest of the world? And I would say this will be a very good case study, would be my view to the rest of the world. I think that our Nuclear Regulatory Commission is seen somewhat of a standard in the rest of the world, and I think that standard upheld very well under something like a stress. I would look at this journey, if you will, as sort of a stress to the regulatory side of things, and I think it withstood the stress very well. I think early on there was some initial things that were put out in terms of the near-term task force. I think we digested those well, and I said we worked through the journey, and I think we landed in a roughly right place. And specific to the NRC and the nuclear industry in the United States, we maintained the design basis, if you will, and maintained that envelope, and invented this beyond design basis and came up with discussions and rules, if you will, around this beyond design basis. And I think that was an appropriate place to land for this. And I think what it did, it reinforced the design basis that plants had, but it also acknowledged that you could have a site devastating event. And if you were to have that site devastating event, we needed to have tools in the toolbox to deal with it. And it wasn't just, let's get ready for a tsunami. Oh, we don't have tsunamis here, so we don't need to do something. It was, no, we need to be ready for a site devastating event. It could be something else, and it could be man-made. It could be natural. We got to be ready, and we are. And our solution fit that, and it fit that, and it worked through the regulatory process. I would say in a relatively efficient way.
That was very good. Okay, well, thank you, Maria. And to carry on, let me again thank Marv and you and Tony and the DOE too, because there was a lot of collaboration that was spontaneous, because this wasn't planned for. And I think this session today, looking 5 years later, we can kind of collect our thoughts. Miles was actually a reporter on the panel. You've been to Fukushima. You've done a documentary on Fukushima. And this was for the PBS NOVA program, I believe. You're one of the top science reporters in the country, working both for CNN and PBS. You've been there. You were, I think, allowed access to everything, ask all the tough questions. And your first show has aired, and there will be a second installment coming. So, Miles, welcome, and thank you for being here today. Miles O'Brien.
Thank you, Doug. Appreciate it.
Gotcha.
Thank you. I've got a third documentary in work. The first one was a Frontline called Nuclear Aftershocks, the nuclear meltdown disaster, the NOVA you're referring to, and one I'm working on right now, on the cleanup and the future of nuclear power, and two NewsHour series in between. I think I've spent more time crawling around those reactors than any reporter. And no, that's not why I'm missing an arm, although I've read that on the internet, so it must be true. I think my experience covering this from the early months on to present has been fascinating, just as a case study in how to communicate and how not to communicate, and how to deal with the media. I think a lot of what we're talking about here on some of the mitigation that has been widely adopted by the U.S. nuclear fleet really goes back to 9/11 and the scary thought of Muhammad Atta buzzing Indian Point. And at that time, there was this wake-up call, what are we going to do about station blackout? What about coping time? And a lot of good practices went into place, which frankly it would have made it impossible to have a Fukushima scenario, I think, in this country. Unfortunately, the Japanese didn't see that as something that they should embrace. And I think that says a lot about the culture there. There's the term, the Galapagos syndrome, comes to mind frequently when you go to Japan. A lot of technologies that only exists there, and an insular nature, which can be its strength, but also a weakness. And I think that insular kind of, you could call it arrogance, you could call it a bit of hubris, was reflected in the way they handled communications, most certainly. And immediately after the accident, they lost credibility almost from the get-go. Part of this is, understandable when you really don't know what's going on. But there was a reluctance to, when it was quite evident that a meltdown was occurring, to even use the M word and say that's what it was. And so in the confusion, matters were made much worse by the fact that there was a reluctance to call things in a candid way and to do a little bit of a truth-telling. There's a lot of deep-seated cultural reasons for that. There is a different relationship between the government and the corporate entities and the media in Japan, which takes a little while for a Western journalist to understand. So what I did was, what a good journalist does, is I reported initially around the edges. On my first trip to Japan, we asked for all kinds of access inside the plant, of course, and got none of that. And when I was working there for Frontline, we instead got a kind of a low-level PR person who really couldn't explain very much to us. And so we ended up going to the evacuation zone and talking to people who had been really devastated by this. I remember going to, I traveled with a family of rice farmers back to a farm about 1 kilometer from the plant. And I was with them at the moment when they realized that they weren't coming back, and it was truly, the Japanese don't reveal a lot of emotions, but that was, they literally broke down on camera. And so I ended up seeing it through that prism before I got a chance to get inside. So each time I would come back, I would try to ask for the kind of access that I wanted. And eventually I saw that they were inviting members of the media in. And so I called up TEPCO and I asked why I wasn't invited on those trips. And they said, well, PBS does not have a bureau in Tokyo. And if you don't have a brick and mortar edifice, you don't get invited. You're not part of the press club. And so then I got a little bit indignant, because at that point I had done way more coverage than anybody else. And I think I'd done a pretty good job trying to be a straight shooter about the story. And it was right around that time that I read that Dr. Klein was involved with the Reform Committee. And so I reached out to him, and he was the one, if I recall correctly, I don't remember your exact words, so if I don't quote you right, please say so now, but basically he said, I want to make you a test case to see how far we can go with this, or something to that effect. And so on the next trip, we did in fact get in, and we got a pretty good look at what it was like there. And it was interesting to me. First of all, it was tremendous challenges working there. Now imagine this for a moment. When they tell you, okay, you can come and bring your camera into our nuclear power plant, but you can't shoot any fences or any doors. Now think about a nuclear plant for a moment and all the fences and doors that there are there. And so it was a big struggle. We had a security person who would look through the viewfinder at each and every shot on that first trip. And you can imagine how frustrating that was over time. But we got through that somehow, and that was in that first NewsHour series that I did. When those pieces aired, the folks at TEPCO and Jeff Hunt with Pulse Point saw them and thought they were a pretty accurate shake of what happened there. And so they called me up and asked me if I'd be interested in getting a closer look, better access. And of course I said yes to that, and I was able to sell Nova almost immediately on the idea of doing a film on the cleanup. And so we went in, and one of the things we talked about at length was how do you do a film about an hour-long film about a nuclear plant if you can't shoot the fences and the doors? Can we please figure out a way to work through this so I don't have a guy standing in front of my lens every time I shoot a door? Which incidentally, you can see on Google Earth pretty easily, just for the record. So in any case, we worked out a relationship, but what was required of that was to establish some trust that was not there. And it took quite a bit of time. I mean, in this country, if I went to the NEI and said, how about we shoot it and we agree to blur out stuff later, that would be a workable agreement. It was very difficult to get TEPCO to the point where they would go along with that, but we finally did. And we had to sit there. We could not leave the country without having gone through and blurred accordingly, but we did leave. We were able to shoot the doors and the fences, and we did leave with the blurs. So we also ran into this sense that there was kind of at the top, at the highest levels, from the CEO to the top-level communications people, had a true understanding of the importance of trying to tell their story to a global audience. I mean, this was, after all, a company on March 10th which didn't have a global audience or a global reach or any desire or need to speak to a global audience. But as you've got filtered down the ranks, it got harder and harder, as it often is the case in organizations. One of the stories we told on the last film was the story of Fukushima Daiichi, not far from Daiichi, which, were it not for a couple of twists of fate, could very well have gone the same way as Daiichi, but it didn't. It turned out to be a very interesting and heroic tale of a couple of hundred workers working under great duress to string together miles and miles of heavy cable to attach their cooling system to the one power source that was available to them up the hill. I thought that was an amazing untold story. And through the course of these harrowing days when all this happened in the midst of things, right after 3/11, there were numerous photographs taken, most of them just by cell phone or whatever, which obviously would have helped my film quite a bit. And of course, I went there and they showed me this whole giant PowerPoint presentation, which just blew me away, and it documented this thing in great detail. And it was a very heroic tale, and it was a tale of the plant manager who really stepped up to the plate and showed great leadership qualities and an understanding of the plant, and was able to really rally the troops. And I thought this was a very interesting narrative. And so I said, well, may I have the photos, please? And they said no. So I went. That actually took another year of pushing on that, and we went through several iterations on what would be released and what could and what needed to be blurred and what didn't. And I was literally at Fukushima Daiichi, and I had the disc in my hand, and a lower-level guy literally came up and took it out of my hand and said, "You can't have it." And I walked away thinking, oh my God, I cannot believe I just sold this whole film to Nova. I am in deep trouble now. So ultimately, we worked on that one and pushed that envelope and did, in fact, get the images, but that took some doing as well. The other interesting thing is, and this is, a lot of, there's so many layers to go through. It's, that nuclear power is very technical. It's hard for the media to understand it, even when there aren't any cultural and language barriers. But when you meet the people right there in the control room, you get a different understanding of what it's like to be working in Japan. People there don't describe themselves as a nuclear plant operator. If you ask them what they do, they say, I'm TEPCO. And they mean that in a very profound way. We were in the control room for units 1 and 2 on the last trip, and we met with the man who was actually the chief operator, the shift commander or supervisor, whatever the proper term is, when it all hit the fan. And he started talking about his tale, and it was truly extraordinary. It was amazing. And I only got about 20 minutes with him, and with the camera rolling kind of in the moment. And of course, it just, whetted my appetite for more. And so of course, all this is being done through translators and so forth, so it was a little bit complicated. But in the end, after we had shot this amazing interview, he did not want to sign the release. And so, my first reaction was, the TEPCO people are telling him not to talk. This is the kind of relationship that had grown over the years, this kind of sense of distrust. And the more I peeled away at this onion, the more I realized that was not the case at all. And as a matter of fact, I took it to the CEO because I thought the interview was so great. And I said it would be just a shame if we couldn't tell, frankly, the untold story of the heroic nature of those people who are in that room, the so-called Fukushima 50, the people who stayed there and literally did not expect to walk away alive, there to do what they could to save that plant. And finally got, through the good graces of the CEO, we got this gentleman on the phone there's a couple PR people there, but it was a direct conversation through translators. And it turns out he had made the personal decision not to talk. Ultimately, I convinced him to let us use that 20 minutes, but there was no way in heck he would let me interview him any further. And what I realized that is something I think Americans don't get right away is that each individual that works for that company, particularly those guys in that control room, take individual responsibility for what happened. They don't see themselves in any heroic terms whatsoever. They don't give themselves an ounce of credit because they are, frankly, scorned by their neighbors. Many of them are out of their homes as well. And so they take no solace in any sort of activities or actions they might have taken, which would have been, frankly, risking their lives to save the day. And so to be put in that light is a cultural no-no. And so, but we got that on the air too. So I guess that's a few anecdotes which give you an idea of a company that had to learn how to communicate on a global stage in an instant in a crisis. That's not easy for really any corporate culture, but in particular in Japan with its unique insularity, frankly, I think it was much harder for them to learn these lessons. And unfortunately what happens is that you lose the trust early on. It's very difficult to regain it. I think what I've seen is a company that's trying to figure out how to do this better. And it's improved dramatically over the 5 years I've been covering it. I think they still have a long way to go with the Japanese people to regain trust to the point where they'll be able to open the KK plant, the largest nuclear plant in the world, even though they've done a tremendous amount of work to fix it. But I think in the end, what I've seen is a company that is trying to figure out what a culture of safety is, and slowly but surely learning that part of a culture of safety is a culture of candor as well. Anyway, if you have any questions, feel free.
Let's have a. Thank you, Miles. And now you're a reporter, so what's the toughest question you could be asked today of yourself? Yeah, what?
So I have to ask myself my own tough questions?
Yeah, ask your toughest question you
Miles,
could ask you.
When did you become so great? And
all right, we'll get questions.
No,
what would be a tough question?
I think a tough question would be, Miles, do you think you fully understand the effects of nuclear, of an accident like this? And I must confess that I spend a lot of time just trying to understand. I mean, I lean on people like Kathy Higley a lot to try to understand the complexities of it. And I constantly worried that I'm not giving proper representation to the technical and scientific realities. And there's so much misunderstanding about nuclear power, so much fear. that I think that's like, it's very difficult to, number one, get that kind of understanding, especially because I'm a history major, and number two, condense that into, a palatable format that is understandable to the public. So I don't know if that's a tough
That's a good
one.
answer. All right. And
Yes.
Yes. Platts again.
Thank you. Stephen Dolly with Platts. Miles, thank you for sharing your unique perspective of being
you're
there
welcome,
on
Steve.
the ground. It must have been scary and fascinating at the same time.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to check one thing that you said. I don't know if it was an offhand comment or if you meant it literally, that the measures required by NRC at U.S. nuclear power plants after 9/11, sort of a mini flex, if you will, have more pumps, more generators available to respond to a severe accident, would have made it impossible to have a Fukushima scenario in this country.
Impossible is probably strong. I'd say unlikely. I think just the
It was
simple.
already unlikely.
Well, the simple fact that they probably, if the Japanese had really paid attention to the lessons of 9/11, the B5B recommendations, and all the things that were embraced here, there probably would have been some portable generators up on the mountain. In which case, it's very likely we wouldn't be here today. It would have been as simple as that. They didn't have that simple capability of having, generators that were dry and ready to go. I mean, you guys can check me on that, on those details, but that's my understanding of it. So, impossible is a strong word, yes, but I would say were it not for that one little fact that they didn't have any power supply whatsoever, and a lot of the remediation that was recommended after 9/11 included just that kind of thing, I think there's a good chance it wouldn't have happened. You're not buying it, huh?
Another question.
There was a pretty sweeping statement. That's why. Can I throw
Yeah,
that
all right,
question
yeah.
over to Maria? Does NEI believe that B5B, these measures after 9/11, as supplemented by Flex, make a Fukushima accident impossible?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I thought if it was really possible, right, then I would tell you that there's other things that we're doing. There's so much defense in depth between not only what you have at your station, but what you have at the station next door, and what you have that is at a national response center 24 hours away. Again, impossible is a strong word, but it's really remote. It's really remote.
You think so, Marv?
Yeah. I mean, and it goes beyond just the pumps and motors. There's the decision-making in our control room. There's the difference, to be honest, in the training.
Look at it, Mike. Can we get Marv a mic? Let's see here. If you don't know, this is Marv Fertel. He's the president of NEI. He's our sponsor today. So he bought the microphone, as we say in Reagan land.
But just to add to what Miles and Maria said, Steve, certainly from a B5B standpoint, you did have equipment at the site. You had training for the people, but it goes even beyond that in the way we train our operators in decision making. To be honest, there was a question asked earlier about the importance of the regulator. Well, and Maria mentioned that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is like the gold standard internationally. We believe that. And having a credible, technically competent, and intrusive regulator makes a difference too. So it's having the equipment there, as Miles and Maria said. It's having a safety culture. We had severe accident management guidelines, which was mentioned earlier. So it's a plethora of things that I would say, yeah, impossible. Nothing's impossible, but you're in an extremely, extremely low probability that our operators would not have been able to handle some event that's beyond them. That's what they drill on in simulators all the time.
All righty. So maybe we'll hold any other questions for our general, but thank you, Miles.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All energy has costs to it.